We hear it all the time, don't we? If he had been black or if he had been white, that this somehow shows white privilege. Does it really even exist, though? Well, we're going to compare two shootings, one of Christopher Roupe in Georgia and the other one of Tamir Rice in Cleveland, and maybe learn something. Hello out there. I am trying to get through.
With cold, blunt analysis, cradled in the warmth of reasoning, it's time for Johnny Walker Dread to straighten you out on a thing or two. Emanating all the way from exciting Las Vegas, Oklahoma, it's the Johnny Walker Dread Show.
Yet another myth of police brutality surrounds the tragic death of Tamir Rice, a 12-year-old in Cleveland who had been wandering around his neighborhood pointing a toy gun at people. One of the neighborhood residents who had been sitting inside a gazebo at the park phoned in the 911 call. The communication that took place between the 911 caller, the dispatcher, and the police that arrived on the scene is rather interesting and in some ways very unfortunate. First, the caller said that the kid was possibly a juvenile. This is a solid indicator that Tamir, although only 12, could have easily looked old enough to be mistaken for an adult. Tamir was 5'7", 195 pounds, which is huge for a kid his age. That's typically the size of a male adult, although maybe a little bit shorter. I think the average height of a male is like 5'9". The importance here is that the police were not on the lookout for a young child, but probably an adolescent. This is Cleveland, and there are plenty of adolescents that pose serious threats to their community. Also, the caller twice said that the gun was probably fake. I'm not sure how the caller made that deduction, as the toy gun held by Tamir looked much like a real 1911. Here is a picture of the toy gun and a real 1911. Can you tell which is real? Could you make that deduction in less than 2 seconds from a distance of about 8 feet? In all honesty, I couldn't, and I own one. Just as importantly, the dispatcher never told the police that the gun could be a toy. This failure on the part of dispatch has been mostly glossed over. The result could be tragic, as the police were on the lookout for an adolescent waving a real gun around in Cleveland, in a real rough area of Cleveland. The dispatcher asked multiple times whether the boy was white or black, but it appears that the caller neglected to answer the question. I'm not sure why. If you have any ideas, post them in the comments below. Okay, so let's take a look at footage of the shooting. Now you may be wondering, why am I not showing this in full screen? The video quality is actually quite poor, and actually blowing it up actually makes it worse, because you're blowing it up past the resolution of the actual source, and so it looks terrible. So this is about as best as we're going to be able to see. Why the video is such poor quality, I have no idea. Okay, so this is Tamir. He's walking around. He's got the gun in his hand, a toy gun. I want to be real clear about that. And he's by himself, just wandering around. It looks like he doesn't really have much to do. And so they have blurred out this person here. Maybe it's a child. I don't know. There is no way that we could identify this person from this video quality. And so blurring it did not do any good. And it might have taken some context out. So shame on them. I know it's policy, but I'm not a fan of it. So at this point, he clearly has the gun in his hand. You can see it clearly there. And now he's going to walk and start pointing it at somebody or something. But it's very aimless. It's like he is so bored, doesn't know what to do with himself. I mean, I would hesitate to call this even playing. Behind him, you can see a person sitting at a gazebo. That's the person who made the 911 call. More of the same, just walking around, trying to find something to do. He's 12 years old. If you ever want to see a perfect example of prime gang target, it's Tamir. I'm not saying he was a member of a gang or he would have joined one, but if I'm a gangbanger, this is what I'm looking for. Okay, so the original caller has left and he takes his spot. Okay, so he gets up, he pulls the gun out, and he's pointing at somebody or something. We don't know. According to police reports, the gun is on the table at this point. It's hard to tell. Okay, so he saw the police car pulling up and he gets out of the seat and is walking toward the police car. Okay? Now, that alone is not an issue. By the way, notice how close the police car pulls up and notice that the car is actually driving in pretty quickly. Now, in my opinion, those are tactical mistakes on part of the driver. But the shooter is not the driver, it's the passenger who has no control over the car. So, a tactical mistake, but not one made by the shooter. Okay, right here, it appears that he is reaching into his waistband. Now, the police are saying that he was pulling his gun out, toy gun. Of obviously from this footage, nobody could tell, but it appears to me that that's what's happening. And of course, this could be confirmation bias. I'm looking for it, therefore, I'm more likely to see it. Certainly, nothing I see here disproves the cops' account of the story. They claim he was pulling a gun out, and nothing here shows me otherwise. And at that moment, the police officer shoots. One of the myths that is bandied around a lot is that the police car was still rolling when the officer shot. I don't see that at all. And the driver's side officer gets out. The other officer takes cover behind the car. It appears to me that they actually do think there is a threat there. And there's no reason to believe that they wouldn't. We do know that Tamir was armed, if you want to call it that, with a toy gun that was very realistic. And we do know that there were calls in that he was armed. So this looks like just a tough situation all around. Okay, so all this happened on November 22nd, 2014. I assume that school was out for Thanksgiving. And I get that he's a young boy. He's 12 years old. In all honesty, I can't see myself doing this at 12. But then again, I didn't grow up in this kind of environment. One thing that really strikes me is the police here have been criticized for acting too quickly. If Tamir did indeed pull the gun, real or not, out of his waistband like it sort of appears in the video, then time is not an issue here. Pulling in too close and too quickly to me is a tactical mistake, but we all make them. And again, the officer who opened fire was not the driver. Now, obviously, not everybody agrees with this account. The lawyer for Rice's family contends that Tamir never pulled a gun from his waistband. In my opinion, pulling in too close to Tamir didn't give the officers enough time to react to the threat. One more thing that played a role in Tamir's death. At some point, Tamir had pulled the orange tip off the gun to make it look more realistic and obviously to make it more fun. I mean, I get it. You're a young kid and you want your toys to look real. You got this orange tip on there. I totally understand why he would have pulled it off. But it was a tragic mistake. With the orange tip on, the local resident would have easily seen that it was a toy gun and probably wouldn't have called 911 in the first place. So kids out there, don't pull the orange tips off the guns. Just a terrible idea. It's there for a reason. Now, Tamir's parents have borne the brunt of a lot of criticism here, but I think that may be unfair. They might not have been aware that Tamir pulled the orange tip off the barrel and probably never figured Tamir would have pulled the gun on police during the encounter, if that's indeed what happened. In other words, they might have been totally surprised by Tamir's actions here. And I understand that you're supposed to teach your kids, how to act when encountering the police, but there's no guarantee that the kids are going to follow your rules. So before I criticize the parents, I would like to know more about the context behind the scenes, and I never will, so I'm not going to pass judgment on them. Now, of course, the issue here is if Tamir had been white, well, you know the rest. But is this even true? Christopher Roupe, a 17-year-old, now he's older than Tamir, I get it, hang on, was playing on his Wii game with friends in 2014 when a cop named Beth Gatney showed up on his doorstep to serve a warrant on his dad. Not him, but his dad. With his Wii game controller in his hand, Christopher answered the door. Evidently, Gatney mistook it for a gun and just shot him dead. She claimed that he answered the door holding a gun, but all the witnesses say it was a Wii controller and no gun was ever collected at the crime scene. Now I say crime scene, at the scene of the shooting, okay? Let's be more clear. Remember, the officer who shot him was still there, so removing a gun from the scene without her knowing it would have been kind of difficult to do. Furthermore, Christopher doesn't seem to be the type that would answer the door pointing a gun at an officer. Christopher was an ROTC student who was planning to join the Marine Corps once he graduated, and everything I've read about him indicates he was a pretty good kid. As a side note, unless he attempted to point the gun at the officer would have had no justification in shooting him. I mean, you can answer the door holding a gun if the police are there. You just can't make an action that looks like you're going to shoot them with it. By the way, Officer Gatney was never charged. Now we can compare the two situations. Both of the shooting officers in these events had pretty spotty backgrounds. Officer Lehman in the Tamir Rice shooting resigned from a previous police gig rather than face certain termination due to the concern that he lacked the emotional stability to be a police officer, such as that he was unable to follow basic functions as instructed, and specifically cited a dangerous loss of composure that occurred in a weapons training exercise. This is not good. His weapons handling was dismal, and he became visibly distracted and weepy as a result of relationship problems. In other words, kind of a Caleb Williams type. One memo concluded, individually, these events would not be considered major situations. Oh, I don't know about that. But when taken together, they show a pattern of a lack of maturity, indiscretion, and not following instructions. I do not believe time nor training will be able to change or correct these deficiencies. I think what he's saying is Lehman should never have been a police officer. Okay. And I don't think anybody here that's watching this disagrees. As far as Gatney goes, the one who shot Christopher Roupe, her background isn't as alarming, but it's still pretty bad. She was fired from one police department for failing to report to work and filing a phony disability claim. She was reprimanded for refusing to follow orders and for leaving her weapon with a civilian while she had her picture taken. Okay, that's just really, really bad judgment, okay? But none of that is terribly relevant here. However, Gatney was also previously investigated for having fired her service weapon at a suspect who was trying to remove his backpack because she believed the suspect was going for a gun. Boy, that sounds familiar. Even though her partner said he never thought the suspect was armed. That's all I know, so I really can't judge her beyond that. Now, the relative violence of the two neighborhoods may have played a role in how the cops reacted to the scene. Cops in high crime areas are noticeably and understandably more on edge. Tamir Rice was playing with a toy gun at the Cadell Recreation Center in Cleveland. This area has a notorious crime problem, even for Cleveland. This article, which I will link in the description, titled "Records Show Cadell Recreation Center Has Violent Tendencies," discusses it in detail. As for Christopher Roupe, he was shot in Early, Georgia, a town of only 4,136. And I checked into it. It appears to have exceptionally low crime rates. Now, age is also a major difference here. Tamir was only 12, while Christopher was 17. And I know a lot of people will say, well, how can you even compare the two? But keep in mind that the police almost certainly thought Tamir was older than 12. For someone on the lookout for a late adolescent, Tamir would have easily passed for 17. How much publicity did these shootings generate? And this is the real sad part of this. Remember, the media is supposed to be pro-white. So they would naturally go ape shit over any shooting of a white kid over a black one. I mean, that's clear, right? Well, Christopher Roupe garners 408,000 mentions in Google. And that's a lot more than I expected. No matter, because Tamir Rice garners nearly 6 million. Of course, much of this could be attributed to Tamir's young age. How did the public react to the killings? Well, you won't find any shortage of protests over Tamir Rice. Take a look at this. I mean, it numbers in the thousands. There were protests all over the country. As for Christopher Roupe, well, you'll see a long string of photos, but none of them pertain to him. These are all for other protests. His name, coupled with the keyword search protest, generated 0 hits. In fact, I couldn't find any mention of any protests anywhere. So, the myth of police brutality, I've said it before and I'll say it again. The reason why the myth persists is because the news media tends to propagate the myth by overexposing these instances when they happen to black victims. People think that black people are more affected by police shootings because the media promotes that. And because people believe this, the media now elevates coverage of these events because it wants the high click rates. So it's a cycle, right? News media glorifies killings of black people. Black people get angry. The news media feeds off that anger by producing more hits on the shooting of black people. It goes around and around and around. So stay tuned for more in this series. Like and subscribe to my channel.